Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, where we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experience. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology who will be bringing you their perspectives on how digital transformation is reshaping the way we recruit, engage, and graduate learners. You'll hear firsthand accounts of how institutional leaders are developing their strategy, as well as get deeper on the stories of how these EdTech tools are being built to foster better student outcomes. With that, let's get to today's episode. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 315, with Dr. Sigal Ben-Porath from Penn GSE. So this is a hot and spicy one here, talking about definitely a major kind of storyline and through line of 2025, the political polarization happening on college campuses all across the country and what it means to have free speech on campus. Sigal is just really committed to this work. I just really appreciate her jumping in for this episode to just cover as much as we earnestly can in the brief time that we had together, and hoping that folks will check out her two books linked in the episode description and connect with the work that is happening there at Penn GSE that she is a part of. Now is an important time, I think, to be having these conversations of how the institutional leaders can navigate political pressure all across the country, from state leaders, federal leaders, and the kind of growing cultural kind of division and scrutiny surrounding higher education. I hope you do enjoy and find something useful in this episode, number 315, with Dr. Sigal Ben-Porath. Been looking forward to this conversation for a while. I think just seeing everything that's been happening in higher education from a political lens, was looking for the right person, the right time to just analyze and look at this, because it certainly is one of the big headlines. We're recording this episode January 2026. This past year has very much been one of the major forces impacting higher education, is just what role does federal government or state governments or whatever else have, and what institutions can or can't do, or different things like that. So we'll do our best to give it its due diligence here in this episode. I'm sure this is not going to be the last time we talk about it, but we will start as we always do, having our guests introduce themselves and sharing a little bit about their professional background, and then we'll go from there to get more into that topic of the day.
Thank you, Dustin. I'm excited to be here. My name is Sigal Ben-Porath, and I'm a political philosopher by training. My main interest has always been thinking about schools and universities as sites where democracy is made. And I'm interested in how education policy, including higher education policy, of course, reflects and promotes, sometimes undermines, our democratic values. I'm interested in how our practices within and beyond the classroom prepare young people for their roles in a democratic society. And more formally, I'm a professor of education at the University of Pennsylvania and the faculty director of the SNF Padilla program, which is our campus-wide program for civic dialogue.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, just you have two really notable books that are out that folks can grab, and we'll link to those in the episode description, called Cancel Wars, that is one book, and the other book is Free Speech on Campus. If you kind of just want to tease those works, and they'll weave into your answers to some of our other questions here, but I wanted to give them honorable mention here at the top of those two works that I think will be really relevant to our conversation here.
Thank you. Yes. So in my previous life, before becoming an academic, I was a civics teacher. And as an academic, I've always focused on, as I said, on the intersection of democracy and education. So in 2015, I was asked to chair the University of Pennsylvania's Committee on Open Expression. And through the work of this committee, I began to observe the ways in which we, at the time, were framing students' voices and students' concerns about the boundaries of speech. Commonly, they would be framed as overly sensitive. People would think about them or talk about the students as snowflakes. And I thought that this was not so fair. And in my conversations with students, I increasingly was noticing a generational maybe shift or adjustment regarding the question of what is the acceptable boundary for speech, especially in the classroom. And my sense was that students were, in their concerns and in the complaints that they would bring forward, were overall reflecting the democratic values that we have taught them: equality and care and collaboration. And I wanted to write a book that would investigate the overlap between these, what I saw as positive and admirable commitments, even when they sometimes were overstated or not always precise, how these commitments align with higher education's sustained responsibility to maintain open inquiry and free speech and academic freedom, how the two of these align. I saw them as typically not competing, but rather complementing each other. And so in the book Free Speech on Campus, which came out in 2017, I discuss what I conceptualize as inclusive freedom, which is an organizing vision that higher education should and typically does manage to enact both of these value commitments, both the commitment to free speech and to inclusion, at the same time in our daily work. And of course, on the margins, they sometimes compete, and I talk about that in the book. But generally, I advocate for and I identify the effort to include both the broadest set possible of relevant ideas and to welcome all members of the learning community and inviting them to voice their views. And inclusive freedom, as I think about it, is the organizing concept for this book, assessing the role of inclusion and free speech in higher education. And a few years passed, and in 2022, I published Cancel Wars, which was really trying to interrogate the new challenges to this vision in the year since Free Speech on Campus came out. For example, in this book, I consider questions of misinformation and disinformation, and I try to investigate the boundaries of speech as it relates to comments or ideas that are misguided, that are deceitful, that are not true in some way, and how we can work in our classrooms or labs or other campus conversations to navigate this changing landscape of mis and disinformation. Or I think about harm and the way the notion of harm expanded to reshape some of the conversations that we are having on our campuses and in our classrooms. So that's the second book. And of course, now I am hard at work thinking about some of the current challenges that we are facing.
Yeah, and I think just the timing of both of those works, and I appreciate kind of giving a full context. Obviously, this topic really became a focal point in 2024. There's a lot of campus protests and everything. So I think that just became more of a current event for people to discuss this issue, but obviously it just didn't come out of nowhere. So it feels like we're now in this very awkward kind of quagmire of neither side feels like it's really working out of this sort of like democratic civil place for discourse and whatever else, or maybe just in the learning environments and whatever. It's all a mess. So I think you've been studying this for a while, so I think you have that full story as you've detailed through your works and everything else you've been doing. What do you see as the current state now?
You are mentioning some of the key issues that are currently on the table, Dustin, and I agree with you that for the last couple of years, we had concerns about protests and the ways that students organize themselves around civic expression and civic issues, particularly when, as has been the case in the most recent set of protests, when you have different factions or different groups, different political views on campus that are really clashing in a very meaningful way. And what do we see as the proper boundaries of expression in this regard? But really, I think the extracurricular, right, like protest and civic organizing, while always very important, some of the pressures that we are seeing now on open expression on college campuses is actually more focused on the curricular aspects, on the more maybe foundational questions of free inquiry. And I am increasingly concerned about some of the laws that we are seeing, especially at the state level, and some of the guidance that is coming from the federal level regarding what it is that we are allowed to teach or talk about in the classroom. And this is something that is affecting mostly the humanities and social sciences. But at the same time, we are seeing that the infrastructure of support and collaboration in the medical field and the field of life sciences is really shifting also to a direction where the federal government is less committed to supporting this work. And so what we are seeing is that on the one hand, the government is moving away from supporting and funding research more generally. And this is a choice that the government can make. This is part of the budgetary decisions that it makes. But I think the way in which this shift has happened has been very abrupt and therefore very disruptive to some of the research that we all rely on and should be proud of. But at the same time that this funding entanglement is happening, we are also seeing increasing involvement of the federal and some state governments in regulating what can be said in the classroom, what topics can be taught, and especially what we should not talk about, what books we should not have access to, and the like. And this is not brand new, but it's been a trend in the last few years, again, especially at the state level. We have seen some state governments introducing what is usually called the divisive topics legislation, which limits what professors may talk about in the classroom. And this goes to a variety of topics, from discussing slavery or other aspects of American history, teaching about the Holocaust, teaching about reproductive rights and especially abortion in medical school and other health professions. So we are seeing a diversity of issues being restricted or directed away from the domain of open inquiry and open expression. And definitely today, more and more attention to teaching about matters related to gender and sexuality and matters related to race, racial equity, and racial history. My real concern in this regard is both topical, right, the substance of these classes or these courses, but it's really more broadly related to the autonomy of higher education institutions, right? Our ability to govern ourselves. And why is this important? I just want to say a word about that. It's not that scholars or administrators always get everything right and we should completely trust them and never ask any questions. Of course, we need to be accountable to the public, who is oftentimes funding or supporting our work in other ways. And we need to be open to critique. Science is predicated on the notion that our work has to be reviewed and continuously amended. But I really think that we have to keep in mind that to substitute an expert's consideration or a group of experts' consideration and review with political or partisan pressure is really to undermine the very possibility of knowledge development. So the question is not, are scientists and scholars perfect and always right? The question is, who should direct scientific investigation? Should it be scientists or should it be politicians? Typically, we have oversight from politicians on the way in which we spend our money and other broad accountability and similar matters. But it is on us as experts to make decisions about what we teach and what questions we ask and how we investigate our various disciplinary questions. And I think maintaining these decisions at the hand of people who devote their lives to studying the domain in which they work is really central to our capacity to continue to serve the public in the way that our mission calls us to do.
That was definitely where I wanted to go, is what is lost when these sort of dynamics are at play, of that idea of, okay, these are divisive programs or whatever, but it's like at a certain point, it's like, that seems to just be in the eye of the beholder. But I think what's interesting is that the sort of student protesters, general campus protests, a lot of people you learn about in history during the Vietnam War or whatever, it was about like external events. It's okay, we here as part of this campus community want to say that we are not in support of X, Y, or Z, but it has been where obviously that has continued, and I think always will, but there has been, like more protest about, like you're saying, like what's happening in the classroom. It has been unfortunate that it does seem like the way that these things have happened have been abrupt, have been arbitrary, have been just that we were on one side, now we're just totally on the other end of the spectrum. It's just like weird, right. Again, like the arbitrary nature to it has always just been very kind of confusing or frustrating to me, versus it being something where it does feel like there's actually, again, which maybe would be too meta, but like a dialogue about dialogue. Let's talk about how we talk to each other, or how we talk about these concepts in the classroom specifically, because I think, there is a lot lost when it does feel like everybody's like walking on eggshells and all that. And that idea that like sometimes it's a particular faculty member, if they say something out of turn in maybe in a personal capacity, that it's like, all right, you're out of here because some power that be doesn't like what you said or how you said it.
And for sure, the conversation about the boundaries of what is acceptable, or how we can direct institutions to be more representative of diverse views where sometimes we feel like they are not. These are, I think, legitimate questions that can be asked, and that the public or its representatives, politicians, and others can ask that and can demand more accountability, can demand that we have responsibly in the funds that are allocated to us, or in the way that we educate our students, prepare them for jobs, or prepare them for democratic roles. For sure, these need to be open conversations. But again, pulling the rug from under a course or a professor or a certain area of inquiry, I think is very apt, because normally to do this kind of work in a responsible way, we need to hash it out, right? We need to have a conversation. We need to hear diverse views. And we need to give some weight, even if not always the final word, but some significant weight to expertise in these areas. Expertise should not be treated as a negative in a conversation about the disciplinary domain, right? If I'm studying something, it doesn't mean that I know everything about it. It doesn't mean that your view, even if you study something else or nothing at all, or you're a public representative, you can still come and offer a view or a perspective or a question that hadn't occurred to me. And that happens to me every day. I teach students about topics that I'm an expert on, and still they bring up questions or perspectives that make me think, and I love that. So, of course, we need to hear each other out. But we have to do it in a deliberative and dialogic way, rather than try to make a decision based on a partisan or other expedient reasons that do not serve the purpose of the institution that we are talking about. Because really there is a meaningful distinction between the general public discourse, whether it's on social media or traditional media or anywhere it takes place, or around the dinner table, between all of these conversations and the conversation on campus, which is supposed to advance and disseminate knowledge. So it's really working from within a different framework where the tolerance for inaccuracy is lower and the tolerance for criticism is higher, right? That's how we should operate. This is the purpose of our work. I think this is currently not very well reflected in the public debate about higher education, and it's not properly reflected in the ways in which some actors in the public domain are aiming to reshape our work.
I think that's a good way to put it, though, that idea of the dynamics of criticism and just how we're maybe providing critiques and our ability to withstand them. And I think there has been maybe a lot of latent sort of criticism that's just bursting through the floodgates. And then higher ed has felt like it's always been able to be above the fray, and now it's being held more accountable. So it's that idea of, okay, we just need to try to equalize these things, because it is the idea of, okay, certainly public institutions or any institutions that receive public dollars should be good stewards of those dollars and accountable to that, versus a politician in a partisan way is just saying, we don't think that program should exist, so you should just get rid of it. It's the end of the discussion. We're not really going to have any more sort of dialogue about that. Yeah, that idea of there's feelings about we're not being good stewards of the dollars. Let's have that conversation, because I think it is an idea of when you boil things down, these campuses are incubators that instill democratic values in everybody who's there, really, faculty, staff, students, and everybody in the community. They can really be these hubs for bringing people together, whether you're taking a class or just attending a program or whatever else. So just to wrap this up and bring it back down, how can we kind of have a North Star in a clear-eyed goal of that what we all should agree on? Of, okay, yes, we would all like to have more engaged and enlightened citizens. What does that look like? How do campuses help instill those democratic values, and why is it so important?
So I think a lot of the work we do in our day-to-day engagement with students is in itself a way of democratic engagement, right? Democracy requires, in a very basic way, a shared understanding of the world around us and a shared understanding of the society that we live in. And if we are to make decisions together as a democracy about our future, we need to have a sense of what it is that we're dealing with around us, both in terms of the natural world and the social world. And democracy requires time to think and engage with those with whom we share this beautiful country, and thoughtful exchanges with others to understand what they think about their vision for the future. So the very process of learning about the world and about each other contributes to democracy. I think all of us, whether we teach physics or we teach political science, we are contributing to a democratic future in which people can learn and make decisions together. But I think more directly, colleges do a lot to intentionally engage with students on a diversity of democratic issues. We sponsor student clubs that teach students how to organize around shared interests and views. Basically, every college that I know of, a 4-year or 2-year, we have college Democrats and college Republicans. We have political unions and debates. We have voting drives, right? So we engage in democratic matters in a direct way. We typically have community engagement opportunity. As you said, many of our campuses are large employers in our different areas. And I would also share that many colleges and universities have programs and centers that are devoted to civil discourse and democratic dialogue. I mentioned that I serve as the faculty director for Penn's program, the SNF-Padilla program, where we introduce students to the value of listening to each other with empathy and curiosity, and the value of exchanging views and reflecting on our own ideas and considering them. This is just one example, but there are dozens and dozens of them across the higher education sector that really focus on the ways in which our ability as individuals to contribute our voice in a thoughtful way and to listen to other people's ideas and visions and voices really is part of the well-being of both each and every one of us and the resilience of our democracy and our communities. My view is that higher education is really a very important linchpin of democratic resilience and civic ideas. And it's very important for each and every one of us within the sector to realize that democracy is made of institutions, and we are one of these institutions. And of course, there are the 3 branches of government, and we have elections and the structures around that. But democracy is really also a set of cultural norms that guide us. And that help us to see each other as equal participants in a shared endeavor, in this enterprise of shared governance. And we live in communities that are less diverse than they used to be in the past, both in terms of partisan leaning and in terms of class and race and other dimensions. And so it is in our learning communities, and especially in higher education, that we learn to see each other in our fullness, then we encounter each other as human, and that we learn to trust each other to advance our shared goals as we are learning together. And so for me, both experiencing the beauty of this democratic effort and reflecting it to the public in a way that allows others to see this work and to rebuild the trust in this work is really the most important contribution that each of us can make right now to the health of both the higher education sector and our democracy.
So that idea, we have to get away from just making so many assumptions about each other and about institutions. Because I think you said that there's so many things that happen that bring civic engagement more to the forefront on college campuses and done in a nonpartisan way. Like just the idea of voting is important. We would love to have as many people voting as possible. And there's often clubs for each of the two major political parties and other sort of values-based kind of community service organizations or advocacy organizations. Even that idea of the incubator, kind of the idea of, we're trying to like nurture just this idea that it's a good habit, it's a good routine to be really living out your values in that way and being involved in the process and having that discourse and everything versus just making assumptions and operating from those, because it is just limiting. I feel like for me, I guess like really trying to distill it down and not getting so caught up in the details of like one specific situation, I think is helpful. And I'm optimistic, as I eternally am, that we can have cooler heads prevail as we head into this year of 2026 to just get back down to these basic tenets that I would think a lot of us would agree to, find that balance of the scrutiny and accountability and all those sort of things, like the criticism and all that. Yeah, like these aren't negative words. And I think there is just, in a challenging moment like this, just lots of opportunity. That's always the way I like to look at it. I'll give you the opportunity if you have any sort of final thoughts or calls to action. The floor is yours. Any way that you'd like to end the episode.
I will just invite people in the higher education sector and people who are benefiting from our work to remember that the effort to learn more is an effort that really is supportive of the whole community, whether it's in a democratic perspective and whether it is for the purpose of getting jobs and doing our jobs well, trying to have good tools for accessing knowledge and learning together in teams and in groups and in communities is really what higher education is about. And doing that in a way that is open-minded and invites diverse perspectives and is committed to including these diverse perspectives in a free speech environment. This really is the core of our work, is what we do every day, and I hope we are able to communicate it to the different stakeholders in our communities.
I think that is such a great point to end on, is like we can't take this stuff for granted. We kind of have to be very intentional about it. The idea of just, it just happens. People just know what it means to be a good citizen or what our democratic values are and how we instill them and stuff. And I think, just like that idea of making it clear and engaging our community on those things, I think is a great way forward that I think a lot of institutional leaders can take action on sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for all that you do and for speaking about this messy topic, but it's messy in a good way. That's just part of the deal of living in a democracy. Just appreciate your time and all that you shared.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to the Higher Ed Geek podcast. This show is a proud member of the Enrollify network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where higher ed goes to grow. So be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit Enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.